Bum 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 bum.
Tomatoes?
Hello, and welcome to the video for C++ with Blueprints, Getting Started. This is the Getting Started video for a new series where we're going to try to introduce C++ or standardized code in a blueprinter's life. This is going to be informal. This is not really intended to be a series or a group of videos that show you how to learn to use C++. We're not going to be learning it. We are going to say, hey, I'm a blueprinter, but I can't do this. Or I'm a blueprinter and I need access to this. Or I'm a blueprinter, let's see if C++ can be of any benefit to me, but I've never really done it before. We're going to create some blueprint projects, and we're going to look at different ways where we might access C++ and use it in our project. So there is a few things. You're going to need Visual Studio. That's kind of the biggest one. So you're going to have to download Visual Studio from Microsoft's website and install it. And here you can see my Visual Studio installer. Community Edition, that's what I have installed. Perfectly fine. It's free for students, open source, individual developers. Now there's going to be a few things that you want that are important. And I'm going to try to cover as much as I can any things that might bite you in the butt as you're trying to do this. If you just click .NET Desktop Development or Desktop Development C++, you should get most of the things you want. You can see here I have .NET Desktop Development. Down here you have Game Development with C++. So if you check this, you're going to get a couple things. It'll install some of the SDKs and some of the Visual C++ tools we need, as well as optionally Unreal Engine Launcher. Now going through the individual components, here's a couple things that might bite you in the butt. Different versions of Unreal Engine require different versions of the .NET targeting or SDK pack, as well as different versions of Visual Studio. The nice thing is, if you run into this problem when you attempt to compile your code or you attempt to compile the engine, for example, if you want to, usually the build bat file will tell you what you're missing. Important things that I have here that I've run into is multiple .NET targeting packs. Unreal Engine 4.21 is the latest version as of this video, but 4.22 is in experimental preview. And that one, for example, targets 4.62, I believe. But one of the previous ones targets 4.61. And you might need the 4.5 targeting pack in order to build a different version of the engine. Right now, I can do everything I need to compile the source and compile C++ in Blueprint projects or by themselves. So these are the options I've installed that have allowed me to do this. These net frameworks are important. Another one you might run into is going to be, obviously you want these ones right here if you need to build out part of the engine. These are the C# compilers you need for that. You need, well, the C++ compiler. As you can see here, version 15.9 latest is what we're using. Again, depending on the version of Visual Studio you're compiling for, Visual Studio Unreal Engine you're compiling for, it may work with 15.6, 15.8. Right now, the latest version requires 15.9. Just read stuff and it'll tell you. After that, we have core C++ features, and there should be one more thing I'm looking for in here. Down here are different Windows SDKs. Even though you're on Windows 10 or 8 or 7 or whatever, different SDKs are required. You might need to install both the 10 SDK and the 8.1 SDK. It'll give you an error. It's going to help out. Beyond that, hey, Visual Studio is installed. We don't need it yet. Working with the code, we are going to create a brand new Blueprint project. And let's just pick one here. Let's go with third person. Blueprint project, starter content. Let's pick a folder. Oh, you know what? That was good enough. Why not? We'll just call this my BP project. And we're going to go ahead and start it up. Like I mentioned before, the purpose of this video is going to be showing how to use C++ with blueprints. We're not creating C++ projects. We're creating blueprint projects, and we're going to add C++ to help us out. Maybe there's a feature in the engine we can't get to because Epic Games haven't exposed it. Well, we'll expose it ourselves. maybe some shortcuts we want. Well, we'll make those shortcuts. Here's our blueprint project. Let me shut off these stupid annoying things. In order to add C++, it's pretty simple. We can right-click anywhere and create a new C++ class. Or we could do File, New C++ class. I'm going to go right-click. Let's make, well, here, I'll show you something you're going to run into. So I'm going to make a new folder called My Content. And I'm going to right-click and do New C++ class inside of My Content. And it's going to present us with our parent class chooser. If you've created blueprints, see, it's familiar. We've got actors, characters, pawns, different components, things like that. Just like blueprints, we have parent classes in C++. For what we're doing, we're going to want to focus on blueprint function libraries most of the time. These are just like the blueprint function libraries, except they're C++ blueprint function libraries. And it allows us to basically make static classes or classes we can access from anywhere that give us access to stuff. So let's say, for example, you want access to a project version. Inside your game, you have a version number. That's great. And you're going to update it, and you want to display it in your splash screen or your option screen. Using pure blueprints, we can't get access to that, unfortunately. But we can create a blueprint function library and expose it because it's already part of the engine, and now blueprints have access to it. And that's actually one of the videos we will be doing. So, blueprint function library. Next, it's going to ask you where you want to name it, and it's going to have the default path. This is not the same as here. This is your blueprint content in your content folder. We're going to get a brand new folder called C++, which is going to be where all our C++ files are. Now you can name these, rename these. You can see public, private. You can choose the different folders. It's not a big deal. For now, we're going to leave it as is because, again, we're learning to use them together. We're not making a fantastically giant program. Name it whatever we want. We'll call it My Awesome Library, and then hit Create Class. Now, depending on how beefy a computer you have, it's going to take a little while. It's basically going to create our C++ code on the disk, generate project files, as you can see here. It's going to have to compile that inside the editor using the C++ compilers we installed. It's going to reload it to have our new access to our new class and our new module. And I'll cover what that is here shortly in a second. Now, I'm going to go ahead and open up this example here. This is what we're going to be learning from. But we're also going to go ahead and look at the one we just created. So right here is what we just created. You can see it's still compiling, and now it's done. Visual Studio will load up, and it's going to give us our generic header and code files, which I'll cover in a second in regards to that. If you've worked with a blueprint project, you'll notice there's a few extra folders here. We have a source folder. Gee, that looks familiar. My Awesome Library CPP. It's where our source is. You have your intermediate folder. This is where it builds things while it's building things, so your temporary folder. And then you have your binaries folder. This is where it builds out your actual modules. And you can see here, here's the DLL for the one, or the module, the code for what I just created that we're using inside of our engine right now. Inside of Visual Studio, we have two files. We are not going to cover them right now. We have our header file and our C++ file. All you need to know about right now is that's what we're going to be working with in the future. We're going to close that down. Let's close down our project here. We're going to go ahead and actually delete a few folders. We're going to delete saved. We're going to delete intermediate. And we're going to delete binaries. Technically, we can delete VS as well. This is what you would normally expect to see for your normal project. Hell, we can delete the solution file too. This should look very familiar to a blueprint project, except we have a source folder. If we right-click on our new project, and we're going to open this with Notepad, this should look familiar if you've ever opened one up, except we have a new section, modules. Now, if you've used plugins before, well, this is basically the same thing, except these are our runtime modules containing our C++ code that we created earlier. All of our source inside of here. If we were to try to open this project now, we're going to get an error. It's going to go, hey, you've got modules. Why aren't you built so we can use those modules inside of our project? It's going to ask you if you want to build them. You hit yes. We're going to show the log right now. You can see it's building it out. Let's make that bigger. There we go. See, we're using Visual Studio 2017. It shows you everything it's using. It's going to take a few minutes. It's going to build it out. And then we're going to have our project just like we had before, now that we have our module or our C++ code built out. Project's still going to work the same. One thing that is missing from here, though, is you'll notice we don't have a solution file. You have your uproject file. That's what we load up inside the editor. We can do all of our editing in the editor. It's our project file. And then we have our solution file. It's our Visual Studio solution file. That's what we load up in Visual Studio to do any code editing. There is a way to recreate that, and I'll show you that here in a second once we finish compiling. You can see it's done. Now if we go into binaries, you'll notice we have our file back. There are other files. There's other files in the source, like these target files. Whoops, let's bring that back. Our target files in there, our build files in here. We'll cover them in the appropriate videos. Again, this is how we can use C++ with blueprints. We're not learning C++. We're not going into all those dark corners. We're just going to add some stuff to our blueprint project because we want to. Here's our project working just like before. We can see we have a new folder in our content browser called C++ classes. And there we go. There's our C++ class we created. Now we could double click on this to open up Visual Studio, but, well, we can't. I deleted our solution file. So how do we fix that? Well, right here, you can see Generate Visual Studio Project. Or, if you're not in here, you can right-click on your uproject file and generate Visual Studio Project files. It's going to go through. It's going to figure out everything it needs. It's going to build it out, and you're going to get your solution file. And there we go. Now we have a solution file. We're going to open up our project. This will be another way right here in order to open up our editor. And we'll show later how we might work with it in this way. When you open up your project with the uproject, you have the editor running, and it's separate from your code. You can edit your code separately from your project. You can hot reload the code into your project, and then your project will reload itself, and they're separate from each other. However, if we're actually doing work inside of our solution file in our C++ code, and we want to debug, or we want to test some other changes where hot reload really doesn't work, then we have the ability, for example, to grab our project here, and we can debug our project by start debugging. And that's going to go through. It's going to build out your project if it needs to build it. And then it's going to launch your editor, so that way it's just like we ran it from the uproject, except we're actually now running it from our Visual Studio solution file. You can see all this funny stuff over here. Our project's loading up like we expected it. And now we'd be able to do things like debugging and all of that inside of Visual Studio. You can see it's running. And if we were to stop it, our editor is now gone, and we've closed it down. So that's kind of our basic workflow for getting a blueprint project, adding some code, and some basic information about Visual Studio and the way it works. The last couple things that are important here, before we move on to actually doing stuff, is references. If you have installed the source in your launcher version, because again, we're adding C++ to blueprints. We don't want the source version of our engine. Here in our little drop-down, we have an options folder, options option, and you have an option for the engine source. Now you notice it says engine installs source CPP files to make browsing debugging code easier. Cannot be modified and rebuilt. If you don't have that installed, if you try to load up certain things when you're working in the code, it's simply not going to find it. So if we want to work in C++, make sure you have the engine source installed to make it easier. But in addition to that, we have a couple other options for our source. Number one is going to be the source. It's the source of the engine. If you go to github.com/epicgames and you are not already a member, you're going to find this page. Or if you're not signed in, you're going to find this page with information on signing up, creating the Epic account, linking it to GitHub, and then getting access to the repository. Once you have access, you're going to get access to this. Unreal Engine repository is what we want. There's a bunch of stuff in here. If you've never worked with this stuff, it really doesn't matter. We don't care. What we care about is we're using this like a giant documentation tool. So for example, if we wanted to find project version, well, on the top left, we would search up project version. And we can look all of GitHub or in this repository. And all the code that uses project version in it is going to be in here. And when we cover this video, I'll show you how we would use this in order to grab the code we need to expose our project version to blueprints. The other one is the actual API or application programming interface for Unreal Engine. API to unrealengine.com will take you to this website, and you have the C++, Blueprint, and Python references. In the C++ references, you have all the stuff we care about. So like, for example, you could look through here for project version, and, well, we shouldn't get an error, so I guess we can't search through that right now. I wonder if we could search through anything. I wonder if this is broken. Let's find out. You can tell I don't really use this very much. I Google for this stuff. So let's go with 100. Okay, well, apparently we can't use that for search. Can we use this for search? Live. It's always fun. There we go. So the search bar at the top will allow us to search through different courses. So here's our C++ API. Here's project version, network version. Here's different things. Like, for example, here's general project settings, and this has got our project version that we're going to want to pull out later. And the nice part about this is any of the requirements we need in order to access this will be listed. Here's hierarchy. Here's how we get access to it. Here's everything we can access. And then down here is the module we would need in order to access all of this stuff. That is basically it. These are the basics of using C++ with blueprints. This is our getting started. This is our documentation that I wanted to cover to make sure that you know and are ready to actually dive in further videos.